So, talking about communism, this is a perfect segue into our next topic, which is Canada. All right, welcome back to yet another episode of Zillennial Money. I am always the world's greatest host of all podcasts. My name is Andy, and we're actually a man down this week. So our resident host, Dom, is away for vacation. I believe he is in Italy right now, so he's enjoying much better weather than me here in Ontario and Tristan in Calgary, Alberta. Anyways, we'll make this work with just me and Tristan this week. So Tristan, why don't you take it away and do a brief intro for those audience members who are new.
Yep, this is Tristan here. Don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe to the Zillennial Money channels. And we've got a pretty packed show for you today, so I will let Andy take it away on the real content. Try to grab Dom's speech, but I couldn't remember it fully.
Yeah, no, I was just about to say he's gone for like 1 week, and you took his line already. So
someone needs to tell the people to like and subscribe.
Great to hear it. Yeah, I try to pack more topics this week just because we're a man short. So hopefully we'll be able to cover even more topics this week. Anyways, let's jump right into it. So the first story of tonight is Apple. A couple of things happened with Apple, actually. So this is a two-part story. So number one, Apple released their new iPads. So I'm not sure if you guys all saw the new iPads. It's apparently the thinnest Apple product ever created by Apple. So this is, of course, not counting the Apple credit card. Obviously, that doesn't count, right? I meant handheld electronics people on Twitter, they're being very pedantic because Tim Cook was like, hey, we've just released our thinnest product ever, and people were like, technically the credit card is thinner. It's like, okay, yeah, whatever, but it's the thinnest handheld electronic, the thinnest actual product, right? And I believe it's only 4.1 millimeters thick, or 5.1. I don't remember exactly what the dimensions are, but it's crazy thin. I actually ordered one, by the way, so it's on its way, but I don't have it in hand yet, but I've seen reviews of it, and it's pretty insane. So that's number one. We can talk about the new iPad and whether or not we think it will be successful, but the second part of that story is an ad that Apple pushed out to kind of welcome in this new iPad. So I'm not going to play the actual ad just for copyright reasons, because I don't want this video to get copyright struck. However, if you, I'll leave a link down below in the description so that you guys can go watch the ad. Is only a minute, so it's not that long. But I'll just kind of maybe put some stills up in post of what the ad looks like, and then I'll describe what's going on. So basically, there's a piano, and then there's other artistic or music equipment arranged in this group, and then you see a hydraulic press slowly come down and just start crushing everything, and then eventually the hydraulic press comes back up, and then it's revealed that it all got condensed into an iPad. So I think the message of the ad was pretty clear, right? It's all these music equipment, all this artistic stuff is being condensed into an iPad that's super thin, that can avoid being crushed by the hydraulic press, because it's so thin that the hydraulic press can't flatten it anymore, or at least that's what I think the idea was, right? But the controversy is that a lot of people had issues with this ad, and they had issues with this ad because it appears that Apple is destroying artistic equipment, right? So Apple's been a big proponent of sustainability, right? They talk about sustainability in one form or another every single event that they do. But it looks like in this case, they were super happy to just destroy a bunch of equipment and destroy like things that people create art with, which a lot of people found maybe slightly offensive, especially those who are, practicing art. So what's more interesting as well is that a lot of the backlash have, or at least I've seen online, have come from Japanese people or Japanese Apple customers in general, because I guess in Japan it's like a different culture where they really value things, and they value like equipment and taking care of your equipment. And if you're an artist, like you take care of your, if you're a musician, you take care of your piano. If you're an artist, you take care of your like paint brushes and stuff like that, right? So it's very like, I guess, jarring to see it being crushed under a hydraulic press. I just want to maybe toss that question to you, Tristan. So what did you? I told you to watch the ad before you come on the show. So like, I believe you watched the ad, right? So what did you think of the ad? Do you think that this ad it went too far? It's offensive, or do you think that it's creative, or do you think that it's actually a good ad? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I don't think it's a particularly offensive ad, at least for me. And I think that something to caveat that with is obviously there are ads that work better for different cultures, different people, different whatever. No ad is really one size fits all. And, showing this ad as if it is a one size fits all ad is probably not the best strat. So in general, like, I don't think it was particularly offensive to me or anything. I'm not like, people break guitars on like stage and stuff all the time, like at concerts and stuff, right? It's not that uncommon. I don't see people like getting angry at people for like smashing a guitar, particularly, like not at least not that angry. So
I mean, if you did that in Japan, though, I feel like maybe people would be more angry,
probably
right? Yeah.
Probably. That's what I'm saying. You kind of got to know your audience and adjust your ads based on the audience. And clearly, this ad was not for the Japanese audience, right? And let's be real. It's probably like not that much equipment that they were actually smushing. And honestly, who knows? Maybe it was AI generated too. Just get the AI to generate some instruments or whatever. The AI stuff's getting so convincing these days that it wouldn't actually surprise me if they did that rather than build a giant hydraulic to smush some musical instruments. So I didn't think it was particularly offensive.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that, and I do think that maybe some people took it too far. I understand that as you said, there is like a cultural difference, maybe, right? Like people in different cultures might have perceived the message differently, but just judging from a Western perspective, again, I'm not Japanese. I do not have Japanese heritage, so I can't speak for Japanese culture. But just I can speak from like Western Canadian / like North American culture, where yeah, like as you said, people destroy guitars on stage sometimes just for artistic expression. And I think that in this case, Apple just did their version of artistic expression, right? And I think that it was actually a very clever ad. And I don't understand why people are so angry, especially like you said, the equipment was probably like they're either props or they're just old / fake equipment, or maybe it's like there's CGI involved too. We don't know, right? But just an update to this story, though, Apple has, for their part, apologized for making this ad, saying that they missed the mark, which in my opinion, they didn't really need to, but I guess they need to kind of appeal to the widest crowd possible, right? So yeah, I just think that this is a little bit unfortunate that Apple like really kind of did a great ad, in my opinion, again, and it's just kind of sad the way that it's been perceived. But I have no problems with it. It's just what I wanted to say. So for the sake of time, actually, let's move on to the next topic, which is also somewhat related to what we talked about with Apple. But I'm going to tie in an extra piece to it too, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So the second piece to this kind of story is that before Apple released these iPads, these new iPads, they announced their earnings. So they had their earnings report, and what's shocking is that they announced a historic stock buyback. So right now, Apple has like 70 something billion on the balance sheet in cash and cash equivalents. Last time I checked, and they've announced the $110 billion stock buyback. So it's not going to happen all at once because they don't even have the cash for all of that. But I assume that they're going to roll in profits from the future and use that to buy back their own stock as well, right? So $110 billion, I believe, is the largest stock buyback, certainly of Apple's history, but of any company's history, like ever. So yeah, this is why Apple stock kind of surged again after they reported their earnings, even though their numbers weren't that great. So they believe they announced that their revenues actually declined year over year. So yeah, like, what do you think of this stock buyback news? And is there a place where this money could be better spent, right? So maybe I could intro this with imparting a bit of my own opinion, but it's just I think that maybe $110, $110 billion on stock buyback is a bit of a mistake in my opinion, because Apple stock is at all-time highs, right? So when you're buying back stock, you have to pay attention to the price as well, right? So for those audience members, by the way, in case you don't know what a stock buyback is basically when a company buys its own stock, and the reason why they would want to do that is to remove shares from the market so that the remaining shares go up in price, right? So it's kind of like a way of giving back to the shareholder without giving an actual dividend. So they could give a dividend as well, but stock buybacks also benefit the shareholder just by making the stock price go up, because money like goes into the market, buys the stock, eliminates the stock from the open market. The remaining stocks, if you're a stockholder, the price goes up, right? So that's basically what a stock buyback is. But you have to kind of maybe pay attention to the value aspect as well, right? Where if you buy back your stock at a high price, then that's not necessarily maybe the best thing to do for your shareholders, versus if you think your own stock is cheap, then maybe it's time to buy back the stock, right? So my question to you, Tristan, is do you think that this $110 billion stock buyback is a mistake? And if so, where else do you think the money could be spent that would benefit Apple and Apple shareholders more? Like, let's say if you were Tim Cook, if you were the CEO, what would you do if not buy back the stock?
I think it's a suboptimal solution. Like I don't think mistake is the right word, because I don't think that it's like necessarily a bad decision. It's just that there's a tremendous opportunity cost to using that 110 billion for purchasing back its own shares rather than say purchasing a different company or something to that effect that could give them avenues into other industries, or give them an advantage in other industries that they are currently operating within, and maybe need some additional like skill or information, like or expertise, right? So I think it's maybe a little short-sighted in the sense of like there's opportunities where they could have bought something more valuable, like a different company or something to that effect, rather than just spending 110 billion on basically nothing. Like really all it does is pump the share price. It's really not going to be providing any additional value for the company. And I mean, if Apple decides to issue shares, it'll just erase that share buyback at some point anyway, right? So I don't think it's a super valuable usage of the funds. It's not like a big mistake. It's not like I'm looking at it going like, wow, I can't believe they would do such a stupid thing. It's more so I'm just kind of like, okay, I feel like you could have done more with that, but I guess it's fine.
I
Right.
guess I will take a more, I want to say, radical or extremist. Maybe extremist isn't the right word, but like a more extreme view compared to what your view is. By the way, I totally agree with pretty much most of what you said, except for the one part where you said you didn't think it was a mistake. I do think it's a mistake. And I think it's actually a fairly large mistake. So here's my reasoning, right? So Apple stock, as I said, is near all-time highs, if not at all-time highs. And when you buy a stock as an individual, right? Like say you're an individual retail investor, you have to pay attention to the price that you pay, right? So as that like Warren Buffett quote goes, uh, price is the value is what you get, price is what you pay, right? So you have to like keep in mind what value you're getting and what price you're paying. So at current prices, I think like Apple's like around like a 30 PE or like or like high 20s last time I checked. So for Apple, that's like a hardware company that I know they're trying to pivot to services, but I think for like now, the most of Apple's business is still centered around hardware, like selling, phones and computers and their, Apple Vision Pro headset now and stuff like that and iPads. So I think that that's like kind of a rich multiple to be paying for a hardware company. Even though, yes, Apple does have a cult-ish, following and stuff like that. But yeah, I still think that like it's a misallocation of capital to be doing a buyback at this stage, and not just a buyback, but the largest buyback in the history of the entire stock market, right? So with 110 billion, so I know Apple's trying to expand into like financial services and stuff like that, right? So they've I'm not sure if you know the story, but like they had a dispute with Goldman Sachs, where Goldman Sachs was the one that's or is still the one that's running their Apple card, their Apple credit card. But Apple has all these stipulations, and Apple's giving Goldman Sachs a really hard time with because they want certain things done certain ways, and Goldman Sachs is like kind of losing money because apparently people are actually using the card a lot, and because the card kind of like annoys you really badly if you like are about to miss a payment and stuff like that. It's people are actually making their payments more often like on the Apple card compared to a regular credit card. So like Goldman Sachs is like spending all this extra money on running this Apple card program, and they're actually not getting as much money back in interest, nearly as much as they thought they would. So yeah, Goldman Sachs is kind of like trying to get out of this contract, and there's a whole dispute between Goldman Sachs and Apple right now regarding the card, right? So it's pretty clear that Apple really wants to get into the financial services space, but they're having like trouble finding partners that are willing to work with them because of all their stipulations, right? So what I think that Apple should do is that they should just buy like a financial services company and just run everything themselves, right? So that way they don't have to go out and find these partners that complain to them and do all this stuff. Like they clearly have a more than large enough cash pile to be like doing some big acquisitions in the financial services space, right? So if you look at a company like Square, right, Jack Dorsey's Block, as they're now called, that company is only worth like I say only, but it's worth like 40 something billion dollars last time I checked, right? So they could buy Square, right, and that'll give them a route into not only like they would own Cash App, right, which is the number one P2P financial services app in the United States. And then they would also own like, a bunch of payment terminal services that run small businesses in America, which is what Square is known for. So they could buy Square, and then they could buy Robinhood, right? Imagine Robinhood is worth like $15 billion, right? Say if like, Apple pays a premium, right? Like, I don't know, they pay a 2x premium? Let's just say they pay 30 billion for Robinhood, right? I think that will be worth it because Robinhood is the number one retail stock trading app. Imagine if they built Robinhood, just pre-installed into every single iPhone that they ship out, right? Like Apple could own that space, like if they just bought Robinhood. And then SoFi, right? SoFi has a banking charter, and then they have like a whole suite. They have stock trading as well. They also have like checkings and savings account. They have loans, and they have all this like debt consolidation services, right? And SoFi is worth what, like $10 billion or something, a little bit less than Robinhood now. So Apple could buy all of these three companies that I just mentioned combined, and it would still cost nowhere near $110 billion, right? So this would be such a big, like, innovative development for Apple if they just acquired, maybe only like one or two out of these companies. They don't even have to buy all three, but they could theoretically buy all three, and they have enough cash for that, as I said. And I just think that that will take Apple to the next level. But I don't know, for whatever reason, the management of Apple, like, they're too conservative, right? And I think that this illustrates a big difference between Tim Cook and Steve Jobs, where Steve Jobs is more of like an innovator, and Tim Cook is very clearly a very good manager. But if you were to try and push him to innovate, I don't think that Apple has done anything that's like overly innovative since Steve Jobs died, right? Like the Apple Vision Pro is kind of maybe the only thing, the only new category of product that Steve Jobs had nothing to do with. And, as far as I'm aware, the Apple Vision Pro is not doing that well in terms of sales, right? So, yeah, let me just toss it back to you. What are your thoughts on that, Tristan?
Yeah, so actually, I kind of want to jump in here with regards to one of my a potential theory as to why they would do the share buyback rather than buying another company, and that's because I suspect that there is a fair amount of negative press in general about Apple and other large companies basically just existing in general, like being as large as they are. And if Apple starts buying up all these big players in a lot of different spaces, then they may be concerned about rising support to break up Apple, in which case they don't, like, the risk to the company itself is a lot higher. So maybe the theory is that by doing share buybacks, they're kind of doing a safe option. They're being like, oh, we're gonna just stay in our space. We're not gonna buy these other companies. We're not gonna buy other places, even though we could. See, we're not just a giant monopoly, and something to that effect to try and basically reduce the amount of pushback on breaking up Apple, for instance. And I don't, and I'm not necessarily, I'm not saying that that's necessarily what they're thinking, but I feel like that may be a consideration that's going into this that we're not really taking into account. Because even if they did try and buy these companies, like, there is a good chance that regulators might come in and kick up a whole fuss, and all that coverage may not be worth it to Apple, especially at their scale. Negative coverage, that they maybe just decided to go the safe route of share buybacks. Because honestly, who's going to go look at a share buyback and complain about it, right? Like, I'm not gonna, if I think Apple is a monopoly, it's not like Apple is buying three different major companies and I'm going, what? This is crazy. We can't let all these companies consolidate. Versus Apple buying, $110 billion of its own shares. Like, I'm kind of like, cool, whatever, and that's kind of, even speaking as someone who follows the stock market, like, I think for the average person, like, if they found out Apple was buying like Square or something to that effect, or Robinhood, they might be like, what the heck is going on, right? Whereas if I was a average person hearing about Apple buying back at 110 billion of its shares, like, wow, that's a lot of money, and that's pretty much as far as that would go, right? So that's kind of my theory on that front, on why they didn't do it.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. And my maybe like counter to that is that if Apple buys like a financial services company, I don't think it would invoke like antitrust action because Apple's not like that into like the financial services space like already yet, right? So if they're trying to expand into like a new thing that's not related to their like own business from before where they're dominating in, they could say that, hey, like we're getting into like a completely new space that has a lot of different competitors, and like yes, we're getting in like as a big company, but it's like we're still new at this, right? So I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, right? But I think I'm sure Apple with their Cashpile can hire the best lawyers that would argue it from that perspective. So that's number one. And number two, if antitrust is really a big concern, what they could do is take minority stakes in these companies, right? So they don't have to buy the whole company, but even if they bought like, I don't know, like 10% of Robinhood or 20% of Robinhood, I think that that would make a huge difference in terms of their future growth potential, right? Just even owning a minority stake. And by the way, this is what FTX tried to do. By the way, like FTX, the crypto company that turned out to be a scam. Well, they actually used the customer deposit money, funneled it to Alameda Research, and then they like did a bunch of like day trading and all this crazy stuff with it. But another thing that Sam Bankman-Fried did with the customer money was he used part of it to buy a stake in Robinhood. And when FTX declared bankruptcy, this actually was kind of like a point of contention. It's like, oh shit, this company that is like a scam basically, and went bankrupt. They own like 10% of Robinhood. So like, what are we gonna do, right? And I don't remember what the resolution of that was, but I think like they just had to like liquidate it or something. And sell it back to like other companies or sell it back to Robinhood. But I'm not sure exactly what happened, but this was a thing that happened. But you know, assuming that FTX wasn't like, let's just say FTX wasn't a scam, and let's just say if they were a legitimate company, I actually do think that that was like a smart thing for them to do, right? Like if they had extra cash that they think that they want to expand into other areas, and they want to take like a 10% stake in Robinhood, which at the time was like, I think they also had crypto, but it wasn't like nearly as big as it was now. Robinhood was mostly known for only stocks back then, I believe. So it's kind of like it's a smart acquisition, right? I think that Apple, who's like definitely not a scam because they're like heavily audited and one of the biggest companies in the world. I think that, and they have enough cash to buy a small stake in Robinhood. I think that they definitely should. But that's just my opinion. And maybe just very quickly expanding on that, talking about Apple, Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's company, has also accumulated a huge cash pile, an even bigger cash pile than Apple. So on Berkshire Hathaway's latest earnings report, they reported that they had $188 billion on hand in cash and cash equivalents. And cash equivalents are like short-term treasuries. So basically, it's like very, very short-term government bonds that it essentially functions like cash, but it carries a little bit of interest. So yeah, same question to you, Tristan, for Berkshire Hathaway. If you were Warren Buffett and you had $188 billion, what would you do with the money? Or would you do nothing at all, which is what kind of Buffett is doing right now, right? He's maybe just holding back and waiting for an opportunity, waiting for a market crash. So that could be a valid answer as well, right? Like you think that the market's going to crash soon, so you're holding back so that you can deploy when everything crashes. Or would you be like, hey, it's a record amount, 188 billion. I'm going to start like buying some acquisitions and taking minority stakes, or even fully buying out companies. Like, what do you think? What would you do?
It's time to buy some Bitcoin. You knew I was going to say that, didn't you? Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would probably be inclined to take some take a few stakes in Bitcoin related stuff, but I know our good friend Warren Buffett is not a big fan of Bitcoin, so I don't think that's likely. But it seems to me like they're stacking up on cash for a potential market crash, which is a fair assessment if they have run the numbers. I'm sure they've got many analysts running the numbers on this, and if their expectations are that there's going to be a market crash, maybe there will be one, right? It's hard to time these things. It's hard to judge. So who am I to say that Warren Buffett is wrong on trying to predict a market crash? He's just as likely to be right as wrong, I would say. So maybe that's what they're planning for, is they're just gearing up for that. And if that's the mentality, then you can buy a lot more companies if everyone drops down 30% and you still have $188 billion of money. So that may be the strategy that they're taking. I'm not really sure what else they would do with that much cash. Seems kind of it seems pretty suboptimal to hold it for very long, unless you're just really confident that there's going to be a major market crash shortly. So we'll have to see what they actually end up doing. But I think that's what they're doing. And I think that's probably. And I mean, I don't think I'm necessarily expecting a giant market crash, but I don't have $188 billion in the first place to bet that there's a market crash on. So maybe clearly Warren Buffett's been doing this a lot longer than I have. So maybe he knows something we don't.
I totally agree with what you said about Bitcoin, but given Warren Buffett's kind of opinions that he's had on Bitcoin in the past, I think it's way too big of an ask for him to suddenly change his mind at 93 years old and go all in on Bitcoin. So I'm not expecting that, right? But yes, if I was Warren Buffett, I would totally deploy like a lot of it, or even maybe most of it, into Bitcoin or Bitcoin related proxies, and just adopt the Michael Saylor playbook on what he did with MicroStrategy, right? Basically, he turned a $1 billion software company that was growing at like 3-4% or something like that into a Bitcoin hedge fund that's wildly profitable, essentially, right? And like an ETF, but a leveraged ETF, but a leverage in a good way where he can borrow money at like really low interest rates and then buy more Bitcoin. And it's like a Bitcoin ETF with no management fees, right? So yeah, I would totally adopt the Michael Saylor playbook if I was Warren Buffett. But maybe if I wasn't Buffett himself, but I was an advisor to Buffett, and there's a chance maybe he would listen to what I would say, instead of advising him to buy Bitcoin, which I know he won't do. Maybe something that's easier to convince him to do would be to buy Tesla stock, right? And before you shoot down that idea, it's like, people would say, Buffett's not a tech investor. He never invests in tech. Well, like, look at his biggest holding right now, right? Apple. And if I remember correctly, Apple has actually been the biggest win of his entire life in terms of dollar amount of profits that he's made. And so, I think that Tesla is really kind of the next Apple, right? If you look at a lot of the signatures of an innovative company like Tesla right now is very, very similar to Apple back in like the early, I would say 2000s or the mid 2000s, maybe, where it's a company with a cultish following, first of all, right? Whether you love that or hate that, that's just a fact, right? And it's got a very loyal fan base. And is doing something in a category of products, electric vehicles in Tesla's case, where it's like kind of setting itself apart from the competition, right? So if I look at other competitors here in North America, maybe China would be an exception because they have a lot of different EV manufacturers there that are not over here. But if I just look at the Canadian and US market, there's not really too many competitors that are close in terms of volume production of EVs as Tesla. right? Like, yes, there is Rivian, there's Lucid, but they don't produce that much, right? There's Toyota's trying to come in, there's Hyundai, there's Volkswagen, but and if you just look at the production and the amount of deliveries of electric vehicles, Tesla is just like wiping the floor with all those companies, right? So I think that this is kind of like very similar to when the iPhone first came out, right? Where you had a lot of established competitors, and there were other smartphones other than the iPhone when the iPhone first came out, right? It's just people overwhelmingly flocked to the iPhone. And the iPhone wasn't the cheapest. In fact, it was probably, I think it was more on the expensive side of when it comes to smartphones, and yet people flock to it. So yeah, I just see a lot of similarities between Apple and Tesla, and I think that if Buffett really wants to cement his legacy, and I am talking about his legacy after he passes away, and I'm not wishing this upon him, right? But let's just face it, right? Let's just be honest. He's 93 years old. He's probably nearing the end of his active years, right? And eventually he's going to be forced to retire, not in the not too distant future, or knock on wood that this doesn't happen, but he might pass away soon. Let's just be honest again, right? So I think that if Buffett really wants to cement his legacy, just he should do what he did with Apple just one more time, just with Tesla, right? It's kind of like the exact same playbook. So he did it once. Here's an opportunity to do it again, right? We had one of the biggest innovators leading the company of Apple, Steve Jobs, right? And then now we have another great innovator of our age, Elon Musk, leading Tesla. I don't know. To me, the similarities is very, very close. But I don't know. What do you think, Tristan?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, that maybe Tesla's an area where he could jump in there. I suspect that, though, with Tesla, I suspect that this may be a scenario where you kind of, by normal metrics and normal understanding of like car companies, if you're perceiving of Tesla as a car company, Tesla is vastly overvalued, right? But you have to understand that it's not a car company, and I suspect that there may be. I think it's difficult for people like for more traditional investors to come to terms with the fact that this company is not, it can't be measured very well with its with the typical way you measure companies, right? And I think that may make it more difficult for Warren Buffett or Berkshire Hathaway to pull the just do it. Like, I think that may be why, because like it seems so obvious to you, right? But like I think for them uh the value proposition is not nearly as readily apparent, right?
Again, I don't have $188 billion either, right? I'm not Buffett, so who am I to be teaching him how to invest, right? So maybe like there will be a market crash and then soon, and then he'll deploy the $188 billion and pick up a bunch of companies at rock bottom values, just like he did multiple times in the past. And maybe I'm just like, I don't know anything, but I think there is a small chance that I am right and Buffett is wrong, or more than a small chance, actually, in my opinion. But again, that's just my opinion. So, anyways, if you have nothing more to add on that topic, let's move on to the next one. So the next story, a bit of a sad story that might also make you kind of angry, is that food bank usage in Toronto is at its highest level since 2007. And maybe I'm not even doing it justice by saying that it's since 2007, because that's literally just how far the chart goes back, right? So like before 2007, I think this organization, maybe they didn't exist, because this is an organization called Daily Bread Food Bank. So, I'm not sure if this organization just didn't exist before 2007, or if they just didn't track stuff before 2007. But since 2007, as early as the chart would allow us to go back, the food bank usage has hit the highest on a per month basis. And this is and if you look at the trend, I put up the chart in the docket. If you look at the trend, it's not just like up by a little bit, it's literally like hockey sticking up. So you can see that the first spike up was due to the pandemic, right? It started in just after January of 2020. So maybe you can argue that that's understandable, right? The pandemic hit a lot of people hard, but you would kind of maybe expect the pandemic, after the pandemic is over, for it to maybe go back down. But that hasn't been the case. In fact, it's accelerated even more after the most of the pandemic was over. So if you look at the chart, I think it's like somewhere around January of 2022 where it hit maybe like a local bottom, and then it just skyrocketed back up harder and faster than ever before. Right. So that's the first piece of news. And then the second piece of news is that we've talked about the federal budget, the liberal budget proposed by the federal liberals who are in charge right now, who's headed by Justin Trudeau, our current prime minister. And yeah, we've talked ad nauseum about the budget and how it's bad for Canadians, and just basically a thousand reasons why we don't like it, right? But it appears that also this sentiment is not just us. So there's a poll that was conducted, and it was an online poll, so maybe you can argue that online polls aren't exactly the most accurate. But I would argue that maybe online polls tend to skew like younger folks, and younger folks tend to skew more left leaning, right? So if anything, considering that Justin Trudeau is a left, like the Liberals that Justin Trudeau is the head of, is a left leaning party, you would maybe expect younger people to be like, more supportive of stuff that Trudeau has done or is doing. So usually I find that online polls tend to be left leaning, but according to this online poll, at least 53% of people are either angry or annoyed at this federal budget that was being proposed, and only 9% is happy about it. And the other 38% is just neutral, right? So maybe they just don't know enough about it to really have an opinion, which is definitely an okay thing to do, right? So I would, I would highly recommend that if you don't know enough about a topic, to not have like very strongly convicted opinions, right? So try to like understand the problem. I see this problem a lot. I'm not like saying this to you, Tristan, or to our audience members, because I'm sure everyone here is well aware of this, but I see this a lot online where people have really strongly held opinions, but they don't actually know anything about the topic. So yeah, maybe 38% of people, they just like, I just don't care, or I just don't know enough to really have an opinion. But yeah, the shocking statistics is between the 53% versus 9. And lastly, here's the latest 338 Canada, which is a polling website that polls, how well the parties are doing. This is the latest 338 Canada popular vote projection. And that very last spike that you can see on the conservative, so the blue is conservative, the 44% one, right? So that very last spike is just because of the news of the budget, right? So I guess because people are angry about the budget, more people flock to the conservatives. So it's not that anything that the conservatives did right, is just like people are literally angry at Trudeau even more after the budget, so they flock to the conservatives. At least that's what it looks like is happening, right? And you can tell that that's probably what's happening because again, like the spike in the conservatives is accompanied by a similar amount of drop in both the Liberals and the NDP support numbers. So I think if you add up kind of the amount dropped of support between like the NDP and the Liberals, you would probably equate to the amount that the Conservatives spiked up. So yeah, it just like there's a lot of news that I just threw at you. So maybe like I know we've talked about the budget a lot, but I just kind of want to get maybe your opinions or your reaction to any of the pieces of news that I just told you. And what do you think about the news, and are you concerned about Canada's future? Because in my opinion, this is pretty concerning news. But yeah, take it.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely reason to be concerned about Canada's future in general. The food bank usage, well, obviously we have more people in Toronto now than we did in the past, which may mean that, there's more people who could be at a food bank now than previously. I still think that the amount that it is exponentially grown, like we haven't just grown, like we have, like Toronto has grown a lot, but like I'm assuming that we didn't gain 200,000 people who just went directly to the food bank, right? So obviously it seems to me that the food bank situation is clearly a lot more people are hurting than they were in the past, and that's why there's a lot of more usage, and there's clearly a cost of living crisis going on in Canada currently, um, which may be encouraging more people to head to the food bank for to help with their the cost of living and getting access to food when they can't afford it, right? And the help help them make ends meet, right? So I think that's obviously a very worrying trend in general. I don't think it's ever a good sign when your country's food bank usage, and I guess this is just Toronto, but like in general, like having a big increase of food bank usage is not usually a good sign by any means. Um, and then with regards to the budget, I think we have kind of beat the budget to death a little bit, in the sense of like I think it's pretty clear that we're not super impressed with it, or at least I wasn't. I don't want to necessarily speak for you, but I wasn't super impressed with the budget. And I think it's pretty clear that most people were not very impressed with the budget either.
It's okay. You can speak for me. In fact, I would recommend you use even harsher words than what you
Harsh
just
terms, straight to the jugular. Yes, this budget was pretty. It was not very impressive, and in fact, I think it was probably a colossal mistake. A lot of the stuff they have on it, and honestly, I think the Canadians were really they clearly are not agreeing with the budget. You can just see that with how the Liberals have lost so much popularity because after the budget was released, and I think a lot of it also comes down to the fact that there is the Conservatives have a lot of ammunition on the Liberals right now. And the fact that the Liberals were toting affordable housing in 2015 for their budget, and then they're back with another fun proposal for affordable housing in their 2024 budget, and you're just like, everything has gotten way worse since 2015. What are you doing? And I think that the fact that the Conservatives could call them out on that made it really, it seemed really disingenuous from the Liberals that this is like, oh, clearly such a top priority, except for the part where it's gotten five times worse since we took office, right? So I think it's pretty difficult, and I think it's pretty clear that people are angry, people want to switch, and as always, I think it's a little bit unfortunate the way that Canadian politics works, in the sense that we basically have two choices, and even if you aren't necessarily super aligned with one, if you're not super aligned with either of the two main parties, the Liberals or the Conservatives, you're kind of in a position where if you vote for anyone else, you're just throwing away your vote. So you have to kind of vote for whoever is going to be the most aligned, and is going to be hopefully bringing you a better scenario now and in the future than whoever has however it's been done previously. And I think based on that, I think it's pretty clear that most people are leaning towards the Conservatives, for that future. And I think that this budget has basically really pushed the limit of like Canadians' patience, because I think that it seems like a lot of Canadians looked at the budget or heard about the budget and went, "This is a bunch of BS. I'm voting conservative." And I think that's really why there's been such a divergence in the the liberal support. I think that there's just been a lot of people who saw the budget and were just like, that's it. We can't do another, you know, whatever, 5+ years of gonna make our houses affordable again, except they're gonna go up, 500%. And I think that people are pretty much done with that. So I think it's likely to be a conservative victory anyway. I think that's not really what necessarily we're talking about, but I think that definitely the conservative victory is kind of where I'm leaning towards at this point.
The big question is, will you help out the conservatives in achieving their inevitable victory?
Well, we'll get on to the next topic, and then we can discuss.
Yeah, actually, the next topic is a little bit maybe controversial as well, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Let me just kind of maybe provide my opinion first, right? So, before our audience members kind of call us out, or at least call me out for being biased or whatever, because I think for the past few episodes I have kind of maybe made some partisan political views or opinions public, but let me just say that I have never voted for the conservatives before in my life in a federal election. Now, granted, I'm only 28 years old, so it's only been 10 years since I was eligible to vote. So there hasn't been that many elections, because on average they're like every 4 years. Sometimes you have a minority government that gets voted because of no confidence or one reason or another, but usually it's like on average like maybe slightly less than 4 years. So there hasn't been that many federal elections since I was eligible to vote. However, out of the federal elections that have happened, I have actually never voted to this day for the conservatives in a federal election. But the way that things are going, this next election will be my first time that I vote conservative. And the reason is, I'm not trying to be like partisan here, but the reason is just simply that we cannot continue down the same path that we're continuing down right now, right? That's just quite simply, like, I don't care if the conservatives were leading us down the current path that the liberals are leading us down, then I would vote for the other party, right? Then I would vote for the liberals to get the conservatives out. Like, I don't really have party loyalty. I vote for whoever I think at that moment is gonna fix issues or move us in at least in the right direction to fixing issues, or at least stop moving in the direction that makes situations worse, right? And what we've seen from this federal budget, as we've mentioned, makes a lot of things worse, because they're increasing the deficit, and even when they decrease the deficit by their own projections, they're still going to be running a deficit by 2027, right? So yes, the deficit is projected to go down like on like a year over year basis, but they're still running a deficit by their own projections. And this is like in ideal conditions if nothing goes wrong, right? So for people who are not well versed in economics, they maybe you hear the word deficit and you don't know what it means, and your brain just turns off. Deficit just basically means you're spending more money than you're taking in, right? So how are you going to make up for the shortfall? Well, you either print the money or you tax people more, right? So neither solution is very good, because when you tax people more, well, guess what? Like, people don't want to do business, people leave, and it's just like our taxes are already high enough, right? It's just politically unpalatable as well. But yeah, that's one option, right? And then the other option is more often chosen, which is to print money, right? That causes inflation. And if you like inflation has become an issue recently just because of how bad it's been. But if you look at inflation, it's never actually been at 2%, if you think about it. So anything that you would want to buy, which is like, groceries so that you can live, or just, post-secondary education for your kids, they've inflated at more than 2% year over year for a long time now. Housing, right? Especially in Canada. So yeah, it's just not a good way to run your economy when you're constantly running these deficits. And there's no reason why we should be running these deficits if the government can just curb their spending, right? So in the federal budget, we talked about this in a previous episode as well. The government is spending billions of dollars on a new AI program to promote AI. It's like, why is the government getting involved in investing in tech and being a VC, right? Just leave that to the private sector, because the government has not, at least this government, this liberal government, has not shown a lot of competency in selecting the best tech firms to invest in, as exemplified by what happened with the ArriveCam app, right? So yeah, I just frankly, I don't trust the government to invest billions of dollars effectively in the AI space at all. And it's just, there's just so many things like, increasing renters protections, which I understand. I'm not advocating for landlords to be able to kick out their tenants for no reason whatsoever. But let me just say that if you make the lives of landlords more difficult, then there's going to be less landlords, because like people who are thinking about maybe renting out their space, it's going to be like, oh, I'm afraid I'm going to get a bad tenant. I'm afraid that, my tenant's going to stop paying rent and I won't be able to kick them out because of these, eviction protection laws and all this stuff. If you make the lives of landlords more difficult, then they might decide not to be landlords. And you say, oh, that's great, we want less landlords, right? Because landlords are the devil. Well, it's like, no, you don't want that. You want more landlords, because the more landlords you have, the more houses there are available for rent. If you have less houses available for rent, what do you think happens to the price of those leases, right? They go up. So yeah, it's just all, the budget is just a big disaster. And it goes to show that the fact that they thought this budget would increase their poll numbers, it's just another, like, it's just the final nail in the coffin to show how disconnected the liberal government is with the everyday Canadian person, with the average Joe, right? So yeah, I mean, who thought this was like, who thought this was a good idea, right? Like, they seriously thought that it would increase their poll numbers. Like, Tristan, why don't you comment on that? Like what was going through their minds and stuff?
I just want to jump in here also with regards to the real estate stuff, like the landlord protections, etc. Like, you realize people will hoard houses, right? Because this is Canada, where you buy a house on Monday and by Wednesday the house seems to have appreciated $10,000, right? Like, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but it's not really unreasonable to expect that if you buy a house in a high increasing city, you could conceivably be just seeing massive, like, 20% increases in value every year. And if, all you have to do is hold the property to get that gain, and maybe that gain is sufficient, that why am I going to risk renting it out and having the all these having a bad tenant that just messes everything up? Like, if I'm going to take that risk in a scenario where I'm already getting all this value from appreciation. If you change the rules a lot, I think that there'll be a lot of people who just like, well, maybe I just won't rent it out then. And, I think that there's often an argument about, like, oh, then we should tax those people who have the vacant housing more. But, that's also not necessarily going to solve the problem either, because the housing market is still appreciating a lot. So even if you're taxed more to have it, maybe that is just still cheaper than renting it out to you, right? And so I think that there is a bit of a concern on that front to take. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have renter protection. I'm just saying that there is a bit of a market that you have to consider, and Canada's housing market is a complete mess on that front. Anyway, to get back to the government budget, yeah, I can't really believe that. I'm really surprised that they released this budget and we're expecting like a positive response. There's clearly some stuff that in there that I think would appeal to their baseline people who tend to vote liberal. But I don't think that there's not enough in there to really drive home to those people that this is still the right choice for people who've been voting liberals. And there's definitely nothing in there for people who are on the fence and are like, oh, should I do the conservative? Should I do the liberals? Should I vote NDP? Should I throw my vote in the garbage for the Green Party? Right? Like there's if they're sitting there on the fence, there's nothing really in this budget that I think you're looking at and going, oh yeah, that is going to solve a lot of my problems. That's going to really help me. That's really going to be an important aspect to my future. And that's something I wholeheartedly agree with. There's very few like stuff in there that is even remotely in that realm. And because of that, I think that everyone who is kind of more so on the fence is like, if it's kind of garbage, like I kind of know what their plan is for the next 5 years or whatever. So if my options are between picking them and having this clearly garbage plan, or picking the conservatives and having maybe a garbage plan, maybe I'll just risk it for the biscuit for the conservatives, right? And the people who might have been on the fence, and I think that's part of why there's been that divergence, is the people who are on the fence might have been like, yeah, I don't think that this is going to work out for sure on the liberal side. And I think that I'll risk it for the biscuit because, by releasing a poor budget, the amount that you're risking it for the biscuit actually drops. Because if you know for a fact that you're looking at a trash tier budget, right? On one hand, you got trash tier budget on this hand, and you've got a maybe trash tier budget on this hand. Well, we know that the trash tier budget is trash. So this budget needs to be not that much better to be better. And the likelihood that I'm going to roll the dice on, instead of maybe if they released a really good budget, I'd be like, oh, there's like a 30% chance the conservatives could release a better budget. But now that they've released a bad budget, it's like, okay, well, this budget is so bad that there is a way lower chance that they're going to release a worse budget, right? So, a lot of people would risk it for it.
Bad budget sounds like a rapper's rap name.
Bad budget.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with it. It's like a loot box, right? It's like a mystery box in a game where you have like a shitty weapon, but then let's say you can give up the shitty weapon and open this loot box, and there's like a 30% chance that you get like a really good one. Mm-hmm. So you're probably going to go for the loot box because like
you've got less to lose, right? Like it's not like you're looking at like an amazing future and trading that up for your chance at a good future. You're looking at a shit future with a chance at a better future. And because you're kind of looking at the shit future, you're just like, well, I'll roll the dice on it, boys. Can't be worse than this, can it?
and let me maybe elaborate on like, what you said about real estate and like the renter protection and like, how potentially Canada's headed down a shitty future. And I do think that the reason is just like everything that the liberals have done so far that I could see is, moving in the direction of eroding the rights of private property. And I say this because let's say if you, buy a second house, right? If you want to rent it out, then they're going to make that process more difficult if you get a bad tenant, if you want to evict them, right? So it increases the bar to be a landlord, because you're going to have to, maybe have more legal resources to hire more lawyers to, like, take care of a tenant in case you get sued or something, right? And their law is, like, heavily biased towards the renter side. So that's one option. Or another option is you buy a second house just to kind of maybe store your value against inflation, because inflation is really bad. Well, then they're going to tax you for having a vacant house, right? So it's kind of like death or exile, right? Like if you choose death, it's death by exile. So like you're dead either way. And it just, like, the government just doesn't want you to have a second house, right? And like maybe I can already hear the arguments. It's like, oh, why do you need a second house? You're just trying to, like, hoard money. Like, listen, we can't be fighting over the scraps, right? Because, like, rich people have more spending as well, right? They make more money, they generate more economic activity, and they go out and they build businesses and services and produce products that we use every day. And if you encourage business, you get more competition, and that's just how the economic machine works, right? But if you drive out, like, all the rich people and you say you can't have a second house or you can't have private property, then we're just fighting over the scraps. And what ends up happening is that the rich people leave and they take their money with them, and then we end up with an even smaller pie, right? So it's just, let's not fight over the scraps of the pie. Let's think about how to expand the pie for everyone. And this is what I've been advocating all along. And this is the exact opposite of what the liberal government is doing right now. And for that reason, I think that they should be voted out as soon as possible.
I think also on that front, just to jump in here again, the fact that we're not going to get rid of landlords in general, but if you make it basically impossible for your average person to become a landlord for an investment purposes, and obviously I think there've been arguments made that, like, houses shouldn't be an investment. Unfortunately, the simple fact of the matter is they are currently an investment. So whether or not they should or shouldn't be is irrelevant. They are one. But anyway, just to loop it back to my original point, though, if you make it really hard or difficult for your average Joe to buy a second house and rent out the second house as an investment property, and they choose not to do it, that investment property is not going to be going to someone else, like a normal person, to go buy it. No, a rental company will buy that property, like a big corporation will buy that company and then rent it to you. And guess what? Guess who will be much less accommodating? Guess who has the legal resources to throw at, all these throw at potential problem tenants? All these, you're basically, by encouraging this, it kind of leads to more consolidation in the rental market. And that's not good for anyone, because if you have one company or a few large companies that are determining the rental prices, then they can set prices a lot higher than they need to, because they need to generate a profit. They've got shareholders that they need to support, right? That they need to provide value for. That's their job, is to provide value to shareholders, right? But if you're a landlord yourself, as you with your second property, you're not necessarily trying to make a profit off of it. You're going to set your prices at a different rate than necessarily a corporation are. And if you're, a good landlord, I'm not saying every landlord is good, but if you're a good landlord, then, you can work with your tenants to ensure that it's a good experience for everyone as much as it can be, right? Like, they get value from you handling all of the maintenance and everything to that effect. And, they get that, like, they get the house, they get the place to stay, right? So, like, it can be a relatively beneficial relationship, and it's not the same situation as with a company and an individual, because if I have, like, an issue as, like, a tenant, where I can't pay rent this month because I've lost my job, and I need surgery, so I can't get a new job, right? a local landlord may be willing to, if you talk to them, they may be willing to, go, okay, you can delay rent or take a month off or whatever, and like you guys come to an agreement on how you're going to handle that, right? Whereas a company landlord is probably just going to replace you with a new tenant because they don't really care. They've got price, they've got shareholders, they got profit margins, they got stuff that they need to do, right? Like they have people that they are accountable to. Whereas, a local landlord is going to be a lot more, on average, a lot more willing to work with a tenant, I would say, at least in my experience. So I think it's a really risky strategy to drive out local landlords. And that's functionally what you're going to do in the long run, because they're the ones who can't afford the legal costs. They're the ones who are taking a larger risk by taking on a bad tenant. Right. So I think it's a risky maneuver on the part of the government. So you could potentially result in less people who are offering rental properties, or you result in companies becoming the rental companies, becoming the rental where you have to go to rent. And they are definitely not going to be the cheaper option, I would say, at least in my opinion. That's kind of my
And
spiel.
also, like, I think if we keep going down this path, we also risk like an issue with squatters, right? So I believe a couple of episodes back, we also talked about certain states in the U.S., especially blue states, right? Like, sensing a pattern here, right? It's the left-leaning states, of course. Like, again, not trying to be partisan, but this is just what I've noticed, right? And what a lot of people have noticed is that these left-leaning blue states, like Washington State or New York, they have issues with squatters, where they have these laws that basically protect squatters, because when a squatter moves in to like a property that's vacant, if they stay for more than 30 days, apparently they're considered a tenant. And then there's like a whole legal process that the landlord must go through before that person can be evicted, right? And that process can take a long time. And during that time, you're not allowed to evict the person until a judgment from a court has been handed down, right? So, you have these people just trying to look for $1 million houses in New York or in Seattle or whatever, and then if they find one, they just move in, and then there's nothing the landlord can do about it. The police won't help them because technically, like, the law is not like on the landlord's side; it's on the squatter side, right? So I haven't heard of that many similar stories happening in Canada. I'm sure like it's probably happened somewhere, but it's not a widespread issue in Canada yet. But that's what I'm afraid that these policies are pushing us down like that path, right? Where if you increase like renter protection too much, you risk getting like people who are not paying rent who essentially become squatters, right? Let's say you can start off being a renter and you can start off paying rent, but then you just decide to stop for whatever reason. And a lot of people, like, if they find out that, hey, like, if I stop paying rent and the landlord can't evict me, then why would I pay rent, right? I'm not saying that like most people will do this, but certainly some people would do it. And then they would stop paying rent and then they become a squatter. And then you can't evict them because of these laws. So yeah, that's just what I'm afraid is going to happen in Canada too. So yeah, your thoughts on that, Tristan?
Yeah, I mean it's possible. It's currently, I don't think our squatters' rights are as strong as in those blue states. I think there's more limitations on squatters' rights, and that's why we don't see it quite as much. But I think that there could be a risk with the rental rights. But again, I'm not saying we shouldn't have some rights. I'm just saying that that it's a balancing act. You need to find that point where the renter gets a good amount of rights and the landlord isn't put in a position where the landlord doesn't either want to risk renting it out or is having to raise prices and be very picky about who they rent to because of their requirements to ensure they have a good tenant, right? So I think that's another factor. Just the whole, like, if you're a landlord and you have to be really picky about who you're going to rent to, that's going to result in you being more specific and more determined and being like, maybe I don't want to rent to this person because they, I don't know, seem like they aren't showing a high enough income or something to that effect, right? And which then makes it harder for people who are, lower income, who may be perfectly fine at paying the rent, but makes it harder for them to find and get the ability to even get a rental, and maybe they'll be paying more or something to that effect. Like it's a really big balancing act that they need to find the sweet spot for. And I think the rate at which they move in Canada, I feel like the ability to find the balancing act is a little concerning, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
my opinion on this is very simple, right? And this goes back to what I said earlier about private property, is that we need to ensure that private property is respected in this country if we want to maintain order, right? Because let's say if you buy a house, you probably sign a mortgage on the house unless you're super rich and you somehow manage to buy a house in Canada with cash, which pretty much no one's able to. You probably sign a mortgage, like you're paying that mortgage for the good part of the rest of your life, and you probably had to volunteer a big down payment, had to put forth a big down payment to get that house in the first place. If somebody can just walk into your house and stay there without paying you, without you signing an agreement with them, or they sign an agreement and they violate that agreement and they're not paying you, then you should be able to call the police and remove them from your property. That's just plain and simple, right? Because it's your property, you paid for it, you're supposed to have control over it. And if somebody disrespects that property, then we have laws that will enable the police to remove that person from your property, right? And I think that anything that violates that, what I just said, is a bad law and it disrupts order in society, like what we've seen in New York and in Washington State and in certain other blue states in the United States, right? So yeah, and I think that's obviously, as I said, it disrupts order in society, and that's you know it's an existential crisis. It will become an existential crisis to the country if taken to the extreme, right? Like if you just let it play out, where if nobody respects private property, again, like what we said about a couple episodes ago about like the police telling you to leave your keys by the door so that if a person breaks into your house to try and steal your car, they could easily grab the keys without you having to fight them so that they can take your car more easily. Again, that's also another example of how private property is not respected in Canada, right? Because you paid for that car, presumably, right? And the fact that somebody is allowed to just walk into your house, grab your keys, and take your car, and the police is not going to do anything about it. And in fact, the police is encouraging you to make life easier for the criminals to take your car. Like, it's just total disrespect of private property. And once you let that go, everything goes, right? Because if you're not allowed to own anything, like if you buy a car, you have to share the car with everyone. If every like person who didn't pay for the car is allowed to just take it and use it whenever they want. If you buy a house, somebody's able to squat in your house whenever they want. Like anything goes. Why would you go to work? Why would you make money? Why would you just do anything productive? Because you're not allowed to own anything. You're not allowed to own the fruits of your labor, right? And I think that's essentially like that's communism, right? Just to put it plainly. So yeah, final thoughts, and then we got to move on.
I think private property is pretty important, because I think we need to be able to own stuff. You need to have a reasonable expectation that people aren't going to just take your things, or else, how does stuff function well? And I think I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but on the podcast at least, but like in my opinion, like with regards to like kind of the more communist perspectives, is that it only really works if there's no scarcity, and we clearly have a lot of scarcity. So if everything is abundant, then it doesn't really matter. There's no incentive for me to take from you if I can already obtain the thing that you have, right? But if there is scarcity, then and there is nothing to protect what you have from me, and you have more than me, why wouldn't I just take what you have? Because I can. And then I think that's a pretty dangerous scenario, right? And I kind of think that private property is very important for a functional society. And until we manage to solve the problem of scarcity, if we ever manage to solve the problem of scarcity, I don't really see how a traditionally communist society can work. Like in without, well, just I don't see how it can work as a communist society. Like, and to clarify that, in my opinion, the countries that are communist in the world are not real communist countries. They're just, you know, communist, if that makes sense. Like they do some things communist, but they really aren't communist in functionality.
They're just communist, but with or they're just capitalist with a communist Stalin mustache.
Yeah, pretty much. Like it's not like it's real. It's not like it's real communism. It's just like fake communism. It's like capitalist communism with with a lot of corruption by and large.
Yeah. So what you said about the scarcity part, though, I think that it's hard for me to imagine a world like just with no scarcity whatsoever, right? Maybe like if we invent AI and it's like the singularity, and then AI would just take care of everything. But then you end up with like, you ever seen Wall-E, right? Like all the like everyone's in those like pods and everyone's fat, and like I think that could be like a dystopian future as well, where there is no scarcity anymore, but like, everyone just kind of like wastes away in their pot because they never have to work or they never have to do anything. And I just don't think that that's like even a very realistic thing to like be able to achieve in the first place. And this is just due to the law of thermodynamics, right? Which says that entropy is always going to increase. So in the amount of like disorder in the universe, it's going to naturally increase. But the things that we make, like, there's a billion ways to arrange like the particles on this computer so that it's no longer a computer. If I take a hammer and I smash it, then I'm going to change the way the molecules arrange themselves, and it's not going to be a computer. But there's like, an infinite amount of ways you can arrange it so that it's not a computer, but there's only certain ways that you can arrange the molecules so that it is a computer. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because that's what like production is, right? When we manufacture products and when we make services, we're lowering entropy, and that requires effort because the natural tendency of the universe is for entropy to go up. But in order to like actually produce things that are useful, we need to lower the entropy of the universe. So yeah, this is just kind of like maybe like a scientist or like a physicist point of view of like why communism doesn't work, is because, as you said, it requires absolute non-scarcity, and it just doesn't follow the law of thermodynamics. It's just the natural tendency is just for things to be disordered and for resources to like be arranged in a way so that they're not useful, and we need to do work to make them useful.
I think I'm also kind of thinking of like more of like the Star Trek kind of I don't know what the word is, like how they have like the fabricators where they can basically make anything that they want with that, right? And that, it's not super duper explained on how they can do that, but functionally speaking, if you want a computer, you seem to be able to just beep bop boop computer outputs, right? And I think that's kind of more so what I'm thinking when I think of like they've defeated scarcity, is that you can kind of create anything you would want. And now the only problem with that is like even with Star Trek in mind, like there's been many examples in all the Star Trek episodes going back of like corruption and different levels of like Starfleet, etc. So it's like clearly it's not a fully functioning society either way in that regard. Like clearly you can't avoid the flaws of humans. Even if you can fabricate everything with a beep bop boop. So I don't know. I don't have much faith in the big red plan, I guess.
Yeah, totally unrelated, but I was watching the Fallout show, and like after I watched the Fallout show, I started watching like Fallout lore videos on YouTube, and it just like the YouTube algorithm, it recommends you like more, like it recommends you like the full box full of Fallout lore as soon as you click one of them, right? So like I was watching all the Fallout lore, and it's like, you know, that robot Liberty Prime in the Fallout universe. It's like they like programmed an anti-communist robot, and it's like that's my favorite character in the entire Fallout universe.
It's really funny because like Fallout is in itself kind of a criticism of capitalism at the same time as being as having Liberty Prime who roast the commies the whole time.
Yeah, no, I totally like notice that kind of anti-capitalist spin on Fallout, and it's interesting, right? Like I think that they maybe they like present capitalism in a way that like shows the evils of capitalism, right? And a lot of the criticism I think is valid. However, I just like talking about Fallout. This is a total tangent, by the way. It's not on the docket whatsoever, but since we're talking about it, I just think that like the premise for like Vault Tech just like nuking everyone just so that they can create like
spoiler.
Like okay, if you haven't seen the show by now, it came out like a month ago or 2 months ago. If you haven't seen the show by now, then like it's your fault. But yeah, spoiler. But apparently in the show it was revealed that Vault Tech was the one that kind of started the entire nuclear war, and they coordinated like, you know, nuking themselves basically so that they can like store themselves in the vault and then wake up after the fallout has all like landed and stuff, and they could return and build like a new world for themselves where they're the rulers, right? And like it's somehow supposed to be like, you know, a great thing for shareholders because they weren't making any money before. But if they eliminate all the competition like violently with nukes, then they'll become the rulers and they'll create the most value for shareholders. Like that doesn't make sense because like why would your shareholders want you to kill them? Right? Like why how are you creating value for your shareholders if you nuke them? Like
I think a big factor with them was that they were very corrupt.
Yeah, like
it was like a partially state-funded organization, wasn't it? Like
but I think it was also a publicly traded company, right? So it's like they have to have retail shareholders as well, right? I mean, it didn't make a lot of sense, like how capitalism could, because the whole premise was that capitalism went so bad that it like arrived at a conclusion where to create more value for shareholders, like, and to create like a need for the vaults, we need to actually nuke everyone and not just create, like I can see them maybe creating a fear campaign and pretending that like a nuclear war was about to happen to drive sales, but actually doing it is like it's not good for everyone, right? Because like how are you going to create value for shareholders if you just nuke everyone and destroy everything? That just doesn't make sense, right? And then like a lot of the people like think the one of the main characters, I think his name is Bud or something, he like turned into a brain in a vat. It's like why would you want that? It's like you could have lived the rest of your life perfectly as a normal human being. Instead you decided to nuke everyone and then voluntarily turn yourself into a brain, into a vat attached to like a Roomba. It doesn't make sense.
Technically he could have done both. He could have lived his life normally and then turned himself into a brain.
Yeah, at least like,
technically speaking.
At least wait till you're old, right? I don't know. I just think like a lot of the like criticisms of capitalism, I think they went like way too far with like their analogies and their like kind of what the message they're trying to communicate was. But yeah,
I think that their criticisms of capitalism were pretty fair by and large, at least in my opinion, but more so because it was not necessarily because Vault Tech makes a lot of sense, but more so just because of the fact that there's so much like major corporations doing, colluding and doing suspicious things, and it clearly in an environment that is clearly not sufficiently regulated to allow these monopolies that I think it's pretty clear do not have the best interest of the average person at heart. So I think that it's like the criticisms is kind of showing like the extreme callous of like a corporation that's gotten too big so far and gotten too big and too uncaring about the people, that it's like, the only way I can, the only way I'm going to make it better for Vault Tech is by getting rid of all the people who aren't Vault Tech. And I think that like, it's kind of similar to how, if you've seen other like things with like robots and stuff where it's like, they're like, what's the best way to solve global warming? And the robot's like, kill all the humans. Like it's like something to that effect, where it's like they've gone too far, they've gone over. And I think that's really what the real criticism is like, they've gotten too big, they've all, everything's about making money now, and they've gone past the point of being really just a company. They're now like a real entity that is like, that basically, by blowing up all the people, that made themselves the ruler of everything, right? Theoretically, right? So I think that it's kind of showing how like how corporations and like companies, people, and like those kind of positions of power can use their position to become like the new dynasty, the new kings, the new queens, whatever, of the future. And it's kind of like how, like, I'm sure in like Roman times, etc., when the Roman Empire fell, there were people who rose from the ashes to become the new leaders of XYZ. And so I think the theory was something to that effect, where they would become that new thing. So it's kind of like turning the oligarchy into like a real oligarchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I know it's a show and it's meant to be like ridiculous at times, right? But that scene was just kind of jarring. It's like they're in a boardroom like with all the executives of all the big corporations, and then they're like, oh yeah, like Vault Tech, our sales are down. What are we gonna do? Let's nuke everyone so that there will actually be a use for all the vaults that we built. And it's like, yeah, like it makes sense if you don't think about it for more than 10 seconds. And then you realize it's like, okay, well, like, yeah, you're making a use for these vaults, but then you're like killing all your shareholders
and your customers, right? Yeah, like who are you gonna sell vaults to? Yeah, hey Frank, you've got a third limb. Let me give you a vault real quick.
Yeah, like capitalism isn't necessarily like destructive like that, like on like a mass scale, right? Like maybe you can argue that certain companies have bad practices that they destroy, local environments and stuff like that. But in general, if you destroy the entire world, then you can't make money, right? And I just think that like, yeah, maybe that's like I know it's a show, so like maybe I
think if I remember correctly, there was also like something about them leaving the world and moving to a new planet as well was one of the plans for Vault Tech. I can't remember exactly, but at least someone was trying. One of the big corporations, their thought process was like, we got to test what happens with these vaults so we can slap people in in spaceships and yeet them off to the next planet. We find out what they do when they're trapped in isolation with each other for like 300 years.
No, but even like the vault experiments, like I think they could have done those without nuking the world, right? Because they're locking the people in anyways, right? So like it's like if you don't tell them what's going on, if you pretend, let's say you do like a, I don't know, a simulation, or you like drug them, or you just like, you know, trick them somehow into thinking that it's real, but you lock them in the vault so that they never find out, but you don't actually nuke the world, and the world is just normal, and you can continue to like sip on your pina coladas, and you can still do the experiments too, right? Like, why don't they do that?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm also like, technically speaking, they only said they'll nuke it. Technically speaking, it has not been confirmed that they did nuke it. You know, so it's possible also that they didn't actually nuke it. Although you know, some theories, you know, there's a little bit of a Vault-Tec logo on Megaton's bomb in the middle of it. So just saying, that's a little bit suspicious. Although I'll be that guy. If you're gonna nuke yourself, maybe don't put your company logo on the nuke.
No, that's kind of suspicious. Although maybe like their thinking was like nobody will be around to see it anyways,
Yeah.
right? So,
It could also have been just an Easter egg, you know, realistically. But
yeah.
either way,
So excited for season 2. Anyway, so we do have to move on, or else this show is going to be 3 hours long. So talking about communism, this is a perfect segue into our next topic, which is Canada. Canada introduces a new online harms bill, which they proposed a new online harms bill. It's not passed into law yet, but it might be very soon. That it seeks to tackle hate speech on the internet. So this, you know, this bill, it's the idea, the intention might sound like it makes sense, right? We're tackling people who are, you know, like bigoted and hateful, and you know, say things that might make other people feel unsafe, might, you know, threaten, might like affect children negatively, and all this stuff. So I kind of maybe understand where they're coming from, but the way that they have implemented this bill, the way that they have written this bill, is somewhat problematic in my opinion. And by the way, I'm not the only one that thinks so. So the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council were among the signatories to an open letter that came out against this. So even the Muslim like Public Affairs Council, which you think that like hate speech, like the Muslim community would support like hate speech protection, because you know, like they're often the target of hate speech, unfortunately, right? But in this case, apparently, like even the Muslim Public Affairs Council are against it. And the reason is because of its potential impacts on free speech, right? So the way that they've proposed this bill, first of all, I think I haven't read this bill myself, but Elon Musk has joined the controversy, and he retweeted this tweet that suggested that there might be potential for retroactivity, for this bill to retroactively prosecute someone who has posted hate speech in the past. So that's if true. And again, I haven't been able to verify exactly whether this is true, because excuse me, I've heard I've heard competing opinions or competing theories as to whether or not it would allow for retroactive prosecution. But you know, we'll leave that debate maybe to another day if once we get that confirmed. But let me just say that if it is retroactive, then this is a huge problem in of itself. But even if it isn't, the bill, the way that the bill is written, is that they will establish a regulatory body to mitigate the categories identified by the bill as illegal or harmful content that negatively affects Canadians, especially Canadian youth. So this is like a very broad definition, right? Like it literally just says like it's identified by this regulatory body as harmful content that can negatively affect Canadians. So this could be a whole variety of content. Problem number 2 is that this like or it's related to problem number one, is that this regulatory body in of itself will have to be created. So this isn't a regulatory body that's attached to that exists already. It would be a new regulatory body called the Digital Safety Commission, which, if approved, will be the most powerful regulator of Canada's internet. So there's all kinds of problems with this bill, right? But let me just before I impart my own opinion, let me toss that question to you, Tristan. Are you concerned about this bill and its potential impact on free speech? And like, what do you think of this bill in general? Like, do you think that we even need this bill in general to like protect against hate speech, or do you think that people should just be allowed to say most things on the internet if it doesn't have, like, let's say, like an immediate like threat to public safety or anything? But if it's just like people being racist or being like hateful on the internet, do you think that that should be allowed, or do you think we should establish a regulatory body to shut them down and potentially even arrest them or fine them retroactively, potentially?
Right. I think that it's way too sweeping. Right. I think there's what is being described here, what could be considered hate speech, is very broad, and the retroactive nature means that anything you've said in the past can be brought up against you. And because the definition is so broad, it's like, okay, did you make a edgy joke back in the day? Maybe that's hate speech now, right? Like, did you, I don't know, have a sense of humor in the last 10 years? Probably there's some hate speech in there, my guy. You like dark humor? There's probably something sus in there. Like, it's very broad. It's very much like using a sledgehammer on a thumbtack. Like, you're trying to deal with I would say a smaller problem by just breaking out the sledgehammer and trying to smash it in, like smash it to you're going to break everything surrounding it at the same time with that approach. And if there's other things around it, you're going to affect that. So it's like very it definitely steps on free speech. There's no question of that. And I don't really think that there's much value for Canadians to have this brought in, because while I'm sure there are people who are committing hate speech, what would be considered hate speech, like by a normal definition on the internet, you can choose not to consume that content. And as long as you are using tools, and obviously if the person is harassing you, that is different than them doing hate speech. If someone goes online and is like, I don't like XYZ, insert race, sexual orientation, whatever, into that XYZ, I don't like that, and they're going, that's hate speech. That's different than if I'm calling up Andy every day and being like, I don't like, you're straight and I don't like that, right? Like, that's different than if I actually, that probably wouldn't fun.
Or it's something like that,
Yeah, like if I was like doing something like that, obviously that needs to be protected against. But again, harassment is not the same thing. So if you are like the people who are doing hate speech online, etc., where it's generally speaking, they're like speaking in a general term. Yeah. Are they a piece of shit? Probably. Yes. Almost definitely. Okay. You don't have to interact with them. There is no gun to your head. There's no one saying you have to interact with them. There's no saying you have to consume this content. So as a normal person, you should be avoiding this. And I don't think that the government needs to come in here and try and decide that it's going to blanket smash everything that is vaguely related to that could be perceived as hate speech, and take our ability to have freedom of speech and like express ourselves and make that more difficult, like, and allow people to like show the true colors of being a piece of shit. Like if they're gonna do hate speech online, like, that they aren't worth your time. That's just great. And now I don't need to ever speak to you again. Like it's not like, so I don't really understand the value proposition for Canadians, right? And I see the downsides as very large because if they're just blanket like deciding what's hate speech, they can apply that definition on a lot of stuff.
Well, to play out devil's advocate, the way that this bill is being sold is partly, well, not like completely, but part of the reason why they're doing this is to protect the Canadian youth. So, what do you have to say about that? Like,
how are you?
Youth spends a lot of time on the internet these days. There's social media and stuff like this, right? Youth are impressionable. And it could negatively affect their mental health a lot if they come across a lot of hate and bigotry and stuff like that on the internet.
Okay, but can the youth not handle going to a different website or not talking to the people who are committing hate speech? Like, or can parents not tell their kids not to go on sites that are going to be full of hate speech? Like, I don't really see why the government needs to be involved in this, because like, and with the amount of power that they're trying to apply on it, like jail time, fines, like and these are big fines, right? 20,000, 50,000, like these are big fines. Like this is not small fish. And then when you add on the retroactive things, like that becomes a even bigger problem, right? And yeah.
To add to that, sorry to cut you off, but the $20,000 or $50,000 fine is actually it's actually worse than you think, because it's not like you're giving this fine to the government. It's actually like somebody can sue you for doing hate speech towards them if they feel like they were one of the people that you discriminated against, and then they would get the compensation of that $20,000 or $50,000 fine. So it's like there's an incentive for people to file a lawsuit under these new laws to report discriminatory speech, so that like you would get fined. And it might not be the same amount. Maybe the government like tax some in. So maybe like if you did hate speech towards like somebody, you get fined like 10,000, but then the person actually receives like 20,000, and it's like the extra 10,000 comes from the taxpayer money or whatnot. But it's like it gives an incentive for people to report discriminatory behavior. So it's kind of like the government's bribing us to tell on each other. So what do you think about that?
That's great. Just even better, man. I'll just oh no. Yeah, I won't be able to benefit from this at all. I was just gonna say I'll go file some hate speech stuff, but I was
you're like speechless as you kind of absorb the gravity of the situation.
Right? Oh boy.
Oh boy. Okay, so maybe now's a good time to share some of my thoughts, right? And my thoughts are that Canada's walking down the path of communism. So I know that sounds like an extreme thing to say, and I probably just offended like a few of you by saying that. But we just spent the past like half an hour discussing like communism and topics in that field. And let me just say, before you call me the next Alex Jones or the next alt-right, like Tucker Carlson or whatever, just hear this, okay? So I am a Canadian citizen, but I was not born in Canada. I was born in an actual communist country called the People's Republic of China. And let me tell you that the way that this bill is being set up, this like Canadian bill, Online Harms Act, the way that this bill is being set up is exactly the way that the Chinese government regulates their internet. So what do I mean by that? Well, in China, they create a committee a special regulatory body that is, that has powers beyond, what the regular, like it's a very powerful organization, right? Has powers beyond the regular police. They create this regulatory body, which goes around, monitors the internet, and then they remove any keywords, right? So if you say like, Tiananmen Square, Uyghurs, or like any of these like sensitive topics that the Chinese government doesn't want you to mention, then it goes and it censors you, and it reports you, and you can get fined, or you can get other punishments, and even jail time and all that stuff, right? So it's basically the Gestapo is what I'm saying, right? You're creating this secret organ, or not so secret organization, but you're creating a special police organization that goes around and monitors like what people can say and what they can't say. So you can say that, oh, we're creating the Gestapo just to regulate hate speech. We're not trying to crack down on like you criticizing like the government or whatnot, like it is in China, but it's along the same lines, right? Like that line can get really blurry, right? So today we accept people getting fined or getting locked up for hate speech, and it's just a short jump to being locked up or fined for criticizing your government, right? Like, what if you don't like what if you don't like Justin Trudeau and you say something negative about him? Like, is that hate speech, or are you threatening a government official and stuff like that, right? So my point is that that line can get really blurry, right? So that's like kind of number one, and like yeah, the retroactive thing is also another potential like similarity to China. If like it doesn't matter if you posted about like Tiananmen Square years ago or you posted it about it now, you can still get in trouble for it, right? And yeah, it's kind of very similar to the way that China regulates, and also it's like China has this social credit score thing where your credit score is basically like how loyal you are to the government and how good you are as a citizen. Whether your social score, it's like a credit score, but expanded to create like to make to include social kind of aspects to it as well. Like if you criticize the government, then your social score will go down, and if you like sing praises about Xi Jinping, then your social score goes up, right? So it's kind of like you create it, if you create an incentive for people to tell on each other, whether it be like you get rewarded with money if you successfully report someone for hate speech, or you get a boost in your social score for reporting someone for criticizing Xi Jinping. It's very similar, right? That's what I'm saying, right? You're creating this like police state where where your neighbors are watching each other, and your neighbors are like constantly trying to report you for their own financial gain or for their own like other gain of some sort. You create like communist China, you create the Stalinist USSR. Like this is exactly how like those countries are run, or were run, right? So yeah, that's kind of my point as to how I think this pushes us Canada as a country towards full communism. But this is just my opinion. And again, I'm sorry if you're offended. I hope I don't get locked up for hate speech for saying that. But Tristan, what are your thoughts? Do you think that my thoughts are too extreme, or do you think there's validity to it?
So I think you tend to go towards communism itself. I tend to go more so that it's more authoritarian than necessarily communist. Because to me, communism is the specific economic, we share everything basically, um, rather than the communist countries that you know we normally think of as communist, because in my opinion they're not like really communist, right? So I think that this is really leaning into the authoritarian side of the spectrum with regards to the political spectrum. So I think and to clarify, I would say that like China is on the more authoritarian side of that spectrum in that regard. Um, if that like and if that for that comparison. So I don't think that. Let me. So it's definitely not a good thing for freedom of speech. Is kind of where I'm at. Like I don't think that I don't think it's something that will be benefiting our freedoms in general. And I think that your point about it being kind of like more communist, I think it's more so that it's authoritarian rather than communist itself. And I think it's basically the only area where we really differ on that front.
Yeah, and I think maybe to clarify my views is like I think if you look at history, all the communist or self-proclaimed communist countries have gone down the authoritarian route, right? If you look at China, North Korea, USSR, Cuba, Venezuela, or Venezuela, I guess is like a heavily socialist government, but it's like they're so far down the socialist pathway, they might as well be communist. And yeah, Vietnam. If you look at all these countries, they've all tended to gear heavily to one degree or another, to various degrees, but they've all geared towards the authoritarian side, right? And I think that there's some, maybe inherent nature of communists or like a communist system where it requires a strong centralized government to have more control over its citizens, right? Because the goal of communism is just to unite everybody and get everybody to work together. But as humans, we don't necessarily always want to go work together, and we don't get along with all the other people, and even in the same country. So the government has to be really strong to be able to like kind of organize things and force everyone to work together and stuff like that. So I just think that kind of forcing everyone to work together nature, it eventually spirals into uh, authoritarianism. Yeah, I whether you call it authoritarian, whether you call it communist, I don't. Again, as you said, I don't think it matters, right? I don't like the development that Canada is taking, whatever it is, whether it be like the communist path or whether it be an authoritarian government. We're headed down that path. That's the fact, right? And this is kind of the concern that I have for Canada's future, among many other things, as we discussed previously on this show. But yeah, that's just kind of what I have to say on this. Yeah. Anyways, there's one more topic that I would like to cover, and yeah, if you don't have anything more to add to that story, let's move on. So the final story for tonight is surrounding a company called Anduril. So if you don't know what Anduril is, it's a defense company. So they make these anti-drone drone killers, they call them. And this one is called the Roadrunner. And as you can see, there's the founder of Anduril. His name is Palmer Luckey, and he is standing beside the Roadrunner. It's about as tall as a regular human man, right? And the point of this is kind of like a reusable missile drone in of itself. So if you have a swarm of enemy drones coming at you, it'll fire up into the sky, and it has some sort of technology that tracks where the drones are, and it's made of like a very like hard material, and it smashes through the drones, and it just basically it's like a probe, but it's like a drone in of itself, but it's reusable. So it smashes all the drones, and then it comes back and docks at the station. So it's a drone killer, and this would be something that would have been very useful if you remember, just a couple of weeks ago when Iran launched a attack against Israel, where they fired over 300 drones, and those drones were was called the Shahid drones. They're like kamikaze drones that they have a warhead attached to it, and they explode on impact. But the issue with those drones is that they're very slow, right? So they're easy to take out. So something like a Roadrunner, like an Anduril Roadrunner, would probably be like a much better weapon to use against those type of drones than what the Israelis ended up using, which was very expensive Iron Dome defense missiles. So it was reported that like each of those Shahid drones, by the way, was only like $10,000 to $20,000 as I've seen some statistics on that. So they only cost around $20,000, but each missile that comes out of the Iron Dome can cost upwards up to like even $1 million per missile, right? At least most of them are probably a few $100,000 like dollars per launch. So yeah, it was reported that Israel spent over $1 billion that night alone just shooting down those drones, and Iran probably spent a fraction of that on the Shaheeds. So something like an Anduril would, in my opinion, be something that's very popular, right? It'll be a company that does really well when it IPOs. And the founder, Palmer, he said that he is looking for an IPO sometime probably in 2025. He didn't exactly say 2025. I'm putting those words in his mouth, but he says that we're on the pathway to being a publicly traded company. So the rumor is that they're going to wait till maybe the market heats up a little more, and people are expecting interest rates cuts soon. So the idea is that once that happens, the markets are going to boom, and in 2025 we're going to have a bull market once interest rates calm down and once inflation comes down, and then we're going to like have a big IPO like again with like a whole bunch of different companies. And Anduril is like one of the most well anticipated companies to potentially IPO in 2025. Again, no guarantees. But yeah, my reason for bringing this up, this story, is that there's a lot of controversy as to whether or not one should be invested in, like defense companies, right, in weapons companies. So this is a weapons company. So my question to you is that do you have any moral kind of qualms about investing in a company like Anduril? And keep in mind that Anduril, this is a defense, like a defensive weapon defense company, meaning that it's unlike Lockheed Martin, which makes like bombs and warheads and stuff and missiles. Anduril makes defensive anti-drone technology. So it's like it's only used when somebody attacks you first, and then you need to defend yourself, right? So it's not an offensive weapon. At least they're not making any offensive weapons yet. So do you have any qualms about investing in weapons companies? And does the fact that it's a defensive only company change that equation for you in any way? Take it away.
Yeah, so I don't particularly like the like it's not an area that I tend to be interested in very much, the defense company industry. And there's a few reasons for that. There's limited opportunities for markets is a big factor. So you're basically having to sell to governments, and as far as I'm kind of concerned, government spending on military is already rather high. So I don't really, I don't necessarily want to be thinking about the fact that I am going to be funding this company's growth by just paying my taxes. So that business model is also not like something I'm super into, as well as the fact that defense companies, obviously there is an incentive for them to have the incentive for there to be conflict in order for these companies to make any money. And I also don't really love the incentive, like that kind of incentive moral hazard that often comes in to how they may deal with other areas. So for example, like I'm very anti the military complex that's just constantly throwing money at the governments, etc., at government leaders, because I think that just leads to corruption, etc. And I think that's a clear issue in my mind. So the the whole industry is one that I'm relatively suspicious of in general. Um, and so I don't really. It's not usually a priority for me to look at for an area where I want to invest my money. That being said, I'm sure that they will do just fine if their weaponry works. The Anduril, they if their stuff works, then I'm sure they're going to have buyers. There's going to be the U.S. There's going to be Israel using the U.S.'s money. Probably some other countries too. So it'll be a pretty. I suspect it'll be a pretty successful company overall. But again, the likelihood that I invest is pretty minimal. That being said, I don't think that my issue necessarily is explicitly with it being them being like a defense company. It's more so like the whole complex in general that I'm more concerned about. And so the morality side of it isn't necessarily that the weapons are designed to kill people or anything like that. It's more so that the company's incentives are to encourage conflict, and I don't like that factor. And so in that regard, them being defensive only, it doesn't really make a big difference to me, because whether they're aggressive or defensive, just because they're not actually blowing up a person doesn't mean that they don't have incentives to encourage the usage of these weapons in some capacity in a conflict. And that conflict will, by extension, very few conflicts result in nobody dying. So by extension, anything that makes this company money will at some point be a conflict that will result in death, destruction, and catastrophe. So it's just an area that I'm not super interested in general.
And so you're afraid of Anduril becoming Vault Tech, is what you're saying.
Not necessarily Anduril, but just like the whole military industrial complex. I think it's a industry that is full of moral hazard, and the way that they do things is probably more aligned with how Vault Tech thinks than not.
No, I totally get what you're saying, and maybe to like kind of belay your fears a little, I would make an argument that maybe like Anduril is something that came out of Silicon Valley, so it came out of like not. It's not like a brainchild of like the current military industrial complex. I mean, I'm sure they have connections to people who are in the defensive industry, but it's more like a tech startup. I mean, they have investments from like Silicon Valley VCs and stuff, which like it's from like a different maybe system than companies that are currently out there, like Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics and stuff like that. So maybe that is like it has the potential to disrupt the way of thinking of the military industrial complex, because it's kind of like run by tech people rather than run by like retired generals and stuff like that. So that's maybe like a positive, right? Because it has the potential to maybe shake things up in the current American industrial complex. So that's maybe point number one. And point number two is I wanted to ask you about Palantir, because a lot of people are kind of making similar arguments for Anduril as Palantir. As you know, Palantir does have government contracts. They have government contracts with the CIA, and they also have, they provide intelligence in Ukraine right now, in the Ukraine war. So they are actively helping the Ukrainians in beating back the Russians and taking back their territory in the Ukraine war. So it is being used for defense purposes as well. And I think that maybe you can make the same argument that part of Palantir's income, which is a significant portion, by the way, I don't know the exact percentage, but a lot of the current revenue does come from government contracts and like their like CIA work and stuff like that, which is like a lot of it is actually classified. So we don't even know exactly what it is, and they can't tell us. But yeah, they are making money from these like military and CIA contracts. So you can probably make an argument that, hey, like Palantir has an incentive to encourage more conflict as well, because they a large part of their income depends on conflicts, right? Although, yeah, like maybe the flip side to that is that, well, they also have, consumer products, and like for not consumer products, but like products for consumer businesses, and stuff like that. So what are your thoughts on Palantir?
Yeah, so there were kind of two parts of that, right? There was the first bit, where you're kind of trying to ease the concerns of the Anduril and its military industrial complex. So I'll kind of speak to that first before I talk about Palantir. So with regards to what you're kind of saying with Anduril, which is like it's more of a Silicon Valley startup. It's not necessarily the military industrial complex, and it may disrupt it. In my opinion, it's just going to become another one of those military industrial if it's not already. Maybe it isn't now, but that doesn't really matter for its long-term future, because its long-term future, if it wants to be doing well, it needs to get on the good books of the military industrial complex, because they're the ones who are making sure they're getting money and selling to the government. So I think that whether it is or isn't corrupted now, it will be corrupted in the future, is kind of my take on that. So I don't think it's like you can go, okay, it's fine now all you want. I think in the future there's no way for them to succeed and not be part of the military industrial complex. And if they are currently not part of it and I invest in them, they're going to become part of it, and then I'm going to be kind of like, you know, kind of supporting the military industrial complex by extension. If I invest in them now, even if they aren't currently it, right? And I know obviously you can't buy them now because they're not public yet. But again, it's not an area where there's a lot of good incentives for use cases, right? Like if they had a consumer side, I think that that's a lot more justifiable. And that now, saying that brings us back to Palantir. To be clear, I don't actually own any Palantir shares, but I will have owned it in the past. And in my perspective with Palantir is that the fact that they have the capacity to be profitable and useful on a consumer side makes them far different from the purely defense oriented companies. And that kind of speaks to that first bit that I was talking about, where the industry itself, for the military industrial complex, where they're always having to get governments, etc., to fund their new and improved bomber or whatever it is. The fact that they have that, and that I have to be an unwilling participant in purchasing their product, whether or not I do or don't agree with it, that's not quite the same with like Palantir, because technically speaking, Palantir, if the world settled down, there was no need for conflict. If everyone just stopped fighting and, everyone chose to stop fighting tomorrow and everything was fine and there was no more conflict for a bit, right? The military industrial complex would have a strong incentive to get that conflict whirling again. Whereas Palantir could pivot into more consumer sided stuff without they would obviously lose some revenue. They would not be basically obsolete immediately. Like if war became obsolete tomorrow, Palantir would still have a value proposition. Whereas if war stopped tomorrow, like what would Anduril do? Like they have a product that is there to solve a problem that would no longer exist. And so that's kind of the difference between the two in my mind. That's not to say that you should or shouldn't invest in any of them. You can make your own decisions on the matter. I may choose to buy Palantir again. I may not. But at this current point, I'm not. They're not something I am looking to add to my position. And Andruil, maybe I will ride an early storm with the stock, or maybe I won't. We'll have to see. But again, I would not. It would not be something that I would be ever considering like a long term. This is a company that I would want to hold forever, or anything like that. If I ever play it, it will be very much something in the effect of a swing trade, where it's just to take advantage of volatility and shorter term market perspectives. Like it wouldn't be something it's not something like Apple where I'm like, okay, I can see the value proposition across the board, right? It's something where I'm not as impressed with the real value of the company.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of long-term invest, I guess it would have to. I would have to look at their financials and see like what the stock IPOs at, and like do an analysis of whether the price is worth it and not or not, right? So I'm not like so much concerned about that yet, because like obviously the IPO is not happening yet. It's probably not going to happen for like at least another year, right? So I'm like not really thinking about that at the moment. And in terms of what you said about the military industrial complex, like, okay, here's kind of like my thoughts in two parts, right? So number one is let's look at Anduril just from a pure business perspective, right? Like ignoring the fact that it's a weapons company. If you just look at like, as a business, I do think that it's got a bright future ahead of it, because if you look at what's happening in the Red Sea, for instance, right, where the Houthis are disrupting the shipping lanes in the Red Sea, and the Americans, along with other, a coalition of other countries, they're trying to stop the Houthis from being able to like hijack ships and stuff. And what the Houthis are doing is that they're launching these drones that cost like a few $1,000s to like maybe like only $10,000, $20,000 at most. And they're using these drones to kind of overwhelm a ship's defense systems, or at the very least, just harass the warships, right? And then the warships will have to fire these Tomahawk missiles to shoot them down. And each Tomahawk missile is, a few $100,000 to $1 million, upwards to $1 million each. So you're using $1 million missile to shoot down $1,000 drone sometimes, right? And this is just not sustainable. So we need something that kind of evens the odds. And like, why do we need something that evens the odds? It's like, in support of American imperialism by extension. Well, it's like, listen, there's bad people in the world, right? And if you look at, let's say, just the Red Sea crisis in particular, I don't think it's fair for the Houthis to disrupt the Red Sea shipping lanes, because that affects, everybody, right? So if I know they're like trying to say that, oh, we're letting ships that are not associated with Israel or their allies through, but it's like, it's disruptive to everyone, right? In the globalized world, where if you, create a supply crisis on one side, if you create a shipping crisis on one side, it's going to ripple through the global economy eventually. And I don't think it's fair for just this one small group of people who, by the way, the like NATO countries, like most of Europe, US, Canada, don't even recognize the Houthis as the legitimate government of Yemen, right? Like we call them the Houthi rebels, because they've been fighting a civil war for a long time. But I won't get into that. But essentially, my point is that there's a lot of bad people in the world, and we need some way to kind of even the odds back in like the West's favor, so that we can defend the West's way of life, right? And again, there's debates on whether we should be defending our way of life, because you can argue that maybe the West is corrupt and the West is like the way of life is corrupt and blah blah blah. But I'm just saying, right? Like so far, Canada has, despite early concerns, despite early warning signs, we have not become full communists just yet, and neither has America, right? And there are certain qualities, I think, of Canada and of America that I think is worth defending, right? Like freedom of speech, for one, that we just talked about for like a whole hour tonight. This is something that maybe a concern down the line for countries like Canada, but right now it's like it's pretty free compared to other countries like China, for instance, right? So I think that we should be spending effort to defend our rights and our freedoms and our way of life. Again, this is a defensive weapon, so it's not meant to, be a bomb that just like drops on cities and kills everybody. It's just if somebody threatens us and fires a whole bunch of cheap drones that are potentially deadly because they have bombs strapped to them, we'll just use this to shoot them down. And then for offensive and for retaliation and striking back, well, then Anduril's not involved in that because they're not making weapons for that, right? So I'm perfectly fine with this as a concept. And in terms of just as a business perspective, again, I think that drone warfare is the way of the future, like it or not, right? I would love a world where everyone just gets along, but unfortunately, that's not reality, right? We have a lot of conflict, and these drones are just going to become more and more popular as time goes on. So we need to kind of catch up in terms of developing these anti-drone technology as well, just to again even the odds back in our favor. So I do think that this is like a good thing, and this would be a company that I do think is also very sustainable. As I said, right, in the future, there's drone warfare is going to just become a bigger and bigger thing, whether you like it or not. And this would be an IPO that would be potentially interesting to me if the price is right. And again, I'd have to look at the financials and stuff, but yeah, that's basically my thoughts. Anything you want to add, Tristan?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, your perspective. I don't think I'll necessarily be joining you on this endeavor, depending on if you do go through this endeavor, but to each their own, as they say. That's all I got to add.
All right, to each their own. Hopefully, we don't end up like Vault Tech in Fallout. But yeah,
We'll see.
Okay, so since you are taking over for Dom's role tonight, why don't you do the outro?
Oh man! Well, thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channels, the Zillennial Money and Zillennial Money Clips channels, as well as each of our personal channels. It's been a great show today. So this has been Tristan Jones speaking. So I'll pass back to Andy to say goodbye.
All right, thanks for watching. See you guys next week. Bye-bye.